I personally have always felt that you and other people we work with actually have shown that you know more than Peter Attia, and that may be quite a hard thing for some people to wrap their heads around because Peter Attia is so famous, right? But this is actually something that I would like to dive into because I'm sure you've learned from Peter before, or at least you've watched his stuff and like you know about him and you've heard his points of view and his perspectives and his ideas on things. And I would say that he's probably the most famous name in longevity. Maybe there's a couple of others who are up there with him. He was even invited to Jeff Bezos' wedding, and so the idea is,
oh wow,
yeah, he is considered the longevity doctor for the ultra wealthy. It turns out that Peter Attia's name appears about 1,700 times, over 1,700 times in the Epstein Files. And for anyone listening or anyone watching, we're recording this in February of 2026, and so there were about 3 million Epstein Files released quite recently, and I don't know if all of them have been released right now or if they're continually releasing more, but supposedly there's 3 million documents here. And Peter Attia's name was mentioned 1,700 times. Not just in passing and not just accidentally, but he was very much linked to Jeffrey Epstein himself. And he had I believe, a working relationship with Jeffrey Epstein. I believe he advised him on many things. I'm just curious on, even before we get into deeper questions, I'm just curious on your thoughts on that whole thing.
Well, that's far beyond the morals that I would tolerate, being associated with anybody like Jeffrey Epstein. But with that aside, I will say that Peter Attia is well regarded as pretty much one of the top longevity doctors. I would agree with that. But his overall model on longevity seems to be fundamentally incomplete and quite basic when you actually look at the big picture of what he is working to optimize on and for. I mean, for instance, most of his interventions are to improve things like metabolic conditions, things like high blood pressure, high triglycerides, or ApoB, which is the actual atherogenic particles inside the triglycerides. Things like improving, insulin resistance and making sure you're not obese. And, by controlling and not having any metabolic issues, you can reduce your risk of the biggest causes of death in the world, that being heart disease, neurodegenerative diseases, and cancers. So it makes sense to focus on, prevention of the major killers. But prevention of the major killers is not really longevity in my mind. It's prophylactically optimizing health and mitigating your risks, but it's not so much actually reversing the aging process itself. You know what I mean?
I see. That let me jump in there in that case, Brenden, because that's a great distinction what you just made. It does seem like, because I know Peter Attia himself, before we even dive into this, stuff about him, he's mentioned like the 4 horsemen of death, I think, something like that, and you covered them basically there, right? And you mentioned that his approach tends to be about prevention rather than optimizing for age reversal and things like that. So with his approach to longevity, it is very much about just like avoid the biggest causes of death. That's really his fundamental approach.
Fundamentally, that's what I have seen with Peter Attia, is it's just risk reduction for the biggest killers in the world, rather than actually how can you reverse the aging processes in all these different tissues in the body and effectively reverse your age back to a more youthful phenotype and so on, which I think is a very important distinction to make, especially if you want to live for a very long time,
100%. I think that's a huge distinction, right? And I get the feeling that a lot of people, when talking about longevity, can kind of confuse those two things, because there's the aspect of just make sure you don't die, and then there's the aspect of like advanced age reversal and things like that, right? And I think that they definitely are two separate things. So I just to rewind a little bit, I'm curious on your thoughts on how Peter Attia came to even be a household name, because that's one thing that I picked up on with the Epstein Files as well, is that Peter essentially went from being quite an unknown, person back in the early 2010s to rising to be like this superstar, right? And I think a lot of people assumed that that must mean he is the smartest guy when it comes to longevity. But knowing what I know about you, for example, Brenden, and other people we work with, and just seeing what I've seen, even for me, I'm like, I feel like Brenden seems to actually know quite a bit more than someone like Peter Attia. And yet people will always assume just because Peter is more well known that he is like the smartest guy, right? And so I'm curious, do you think that his rise into being as famous as he became, do you think that a lot of that was skill, or do you think that, judging by how much he was interrelated with Epstein, that maybe that was something that actually played quite a big role?
Well, I'm not one to speculate too much. I prefer to stick to the facts of things and the science of things. But I will say that having connections like Jeffrey Epstein definitely doesn't hurt, in order to become well known and to potentially grow and things like that. So I would say it's a strong possible contributor to his success, but I don't want to say definitely that's the case. But because I will say that from a longevity perspective in the Western world, if you look to that narrow part of the world, he is a little step ahead of traditional Western medicine, but not much. And when you look at him from a global perspective, it's far behind some of the Eastern European and post-Soviet countries and their interventions and stuff, which I've never even heard him speak on. So I will say that maybe it's because he's just the best speaker in the Western world as well,
When it comes to longevity, or when it comes to, his version of longevity?
Yeah, I mean, that could be. I mean, I haven't known of him since 2010, you said, is when he started on YouTube. I really only recognized him about 5 years ago.
Come up, yeah. Yeah, gotcha. I'm curious on your thoughts on, because someone like Peter Attia was and seemingly still is the face of, basically the global face of longevity, if you will. And there could be an argument made that maybe a couple of other people are, maybe Brian Johnson would like to make that claim that he's the face of longevity. But I think Peter Attia is quite a big one. Do you think that this is a two-part question. The first part is, do you think that Peter Attia being the longevity guy, do you think that was good for the space, even let's say before the whole Epstein stuff? Do you think it was a good thing that people would associate his teachings with, the longevity space?
It's not a terrible thing because, like I said, his advice is not bad. That's not an issue that I have with him. It's just that it's fundamentally incomplete if you want to reverse the aging process itself. His advice isn't bad if you just want to be healthy and reduce your risk of the most common causes of disease in the world. But you got to take into consideration that if you don't die from heart disease, cancer, or neurodegenerative diseases, say you reduce your risk significantly there, the aging process still continues and something is going to kill you eventually. So if you don't optimize other systems which control the aging processes, then you're still going to be behind somebody who is working to do such a thing. You know what I mean? So
yeah. Okay. The second part of the question is, now that all this has come to light, and it turns out that he was, in fact, very much looking to bolster his career by getting these connections, regardless of, the morals or ethics that may, the implications that come from that, it seemed like he just wanted to be connected to the ultra wealthy so that he could essentially charge them a lot of money, right? Do you think that the longevity space, which is also quite well known for having a lot of shady characters in it, right? Like people who are grifters, charlatans, things like that. Do you think that these new findings are going to harm the longevity space in general? Or do you think that, maybe with good science and good teachings that we can really push this space forward anyway?
Well, I think that anytime somebody's ethics are exposed and put into question like this, in such case of Peter Attia being associated with Epstein, I think that it just should make somebody consider, what else are they potentially being unethical about, and especially if he does have connections to the ultra wealthy. These are people who are going to want to have an unfair advantage over others. So there's also the question of, what does Peter Attia actually know that he isn't saying or revealing to the public, that he is keeping secret for some of the elites potentially, you know. And
Yeah.
for all I know, Dan, he may know about some of the things that I know about with the post-Soviet medicine and the Eastern European medicine, which we are using to optimize the health and longevity and reverse the aging process in clients now. And he may be utilizing some of those things for the ultra elite, you know, for all I know. But
that's a very good point, Brenden, because that's actually something I've thought about before, even with others, where, for example, you'll be spreading knowledge about peptides, and it's clear they work. The science proves that it works. All of our work proves that it works. And yet, a lot of the time, even some of these, longevity influencers, they will actually suppress talk about peptides. They will actually silence and ban people that talk about peptides. And it's like, why are they doing that? If they didn't work, they would just say that, right? They wouldn't ban people for bringing it up. And so you bring up a really good point. Yeah, that perhaps they're using a lot of these with their ultra wealthy clients, and they're just a lot of these interventions that you've discovered and found, and then perhaps they're just not sharing them with the public.
It's possible. I mean, I have left a comment on Brian Johnson's video before about peptides, and the comment was deleted, and then apparently I was blocked from the channel and wasn't able to comment. So I don't know what's up with that in particular, but yeah, I mean,
it's very possible that they're doing privately and, with their ultra wealthy clients is different than what they're just sharing publicly. It's a very good point. Yeah.
Yeah.
So let's talk about some of
By the way, Dan, before you move on, do you remember
ahead.
a couple years ago, I actually reached out to Peter Attia and I wanted to discuss peptides with him because I thought it was a significant finding and that there was a lot of reason for people using these peptides if they want to reverse the aging process. I thought it would be something he would be highly interested in because I've never heard him speak on that topic before, but he has spoke on epigenetics in general, which gene regulatory peptides relate to directly, so it should have been something that he had a high interest in that would be right up his alley and interesting to discuss. But I reached out to him. I even sent him some information. I believe I sent him a PDF that even had like 15 or 20 citations on it about these particular peptides, and I was just hoping for a response. But him and his team never replied. And I also reached out to some people who are associated with him closely, some people who have been on his podcast in the past, and they all ignored me as well. So I'm sure they get a lot of messages in general, and they have some people who go through and filter those based on what they feel is high priority or not. But you would think such a thing would have made it through.
Yes. Yeah, it does make you question some things because what you were showing was no joke. It was not small. A lot of the things you were showing were very profound and very significant, but seemingly not significant enough to be either worth mentioning, or it was so significant that they didn't want to talk about it. And in a way,
exactly, and that's the question. Because
in a way,
I mean, Jeff Bezos knows the power of epigenetic therapies. That's what one of his age reversal companies is built around. Altos Labs. They're working to control epigenetics so that they can reverse the aging process. And it's built off of prior work of the Yamanaka factors, at least according to one section of their website, which for those who don't know, the Yamanaka factors are a set of 4 distinct genes, which when expressed can return an aged cell in a petri dish to basically an embryonic state. So a state before the cell actually has an identity, before it's committed to a specific lineage, it can return that cell back to pluripotency, basically. And there's big problems with using the Yamanaka factors, when it comes to actual biological systems, like actual living beings and such. And the biggest problems were oncogenesis, which is cancer development, but there's also some other big concerns just in regards to health and how that organism will respond in the long term to such interventions that make them pretty risky, pretty risky therapies. And I understand just based on the power of them, though, wanting to look further into that area of research to see if there's anything else you can come up with that can reverse the aging process in a safe way that is effective and not putting somebody at risk of other diseases or, adverse outcomes. But it's just weird that a company like Jeff Bezos's Altos Labs has never mentioned anything regarding gene regulatory peptides. I mean, it sounds like exactly what he would be interested in, and
It is
Just
fascinating.
nothing new.
Yeah, it's very fascinating. Do you think that even when it comes to these labs and these researchers, because there's still research being done on a lot of these peptides. Do you think that a lot of it is just very fractured, and for some reason the information, like, it's very fractured and fragmented, where the information, the research, the discoveries just doesn't reach these other researchers, these other scientists? It's almost like siloed.
Well, I think that's a great point, Dan. The research is very fragmented and fractured. And I think if somebody comes across just a couple pieces of the research on these types of therapies, they may be very quick to just dismiss it and call it like as bullshit, like not believe it.
Yeah.
And it would really take somebody to be intrigued enough by what they do see to dive deeper into that entire area of research and read like hundreds of papers and translate hundreds of papers, to get a better understanding on them. And I think that most people just, they're not interested enough to go that deep based on what they initially see. But that's one of the reasons why I actually put together essentially a resource kit, which is what I sent out to Peter Attia and some of his associates, because I thought that it would have enough information in it to really get their attention and help them to realize that, wow, this is really legit, but yet that's even gone ignored. So
yeah, even it's just mind-blowing to me that even Jeff Bezos labs and things like that are just, so many of them are just missing things, which no one would expect this to be the case, right? Most people listening, I'm sure, would be like, well, if a billionaire is funding this lab and he really wants these results, it must be the best, right? But I think in a way, yeah,
there could be financial incentives behind it because, of course, Altos Labs is a $1 billion lab. They're spending tons of money, and obviously they don't want to take a loss there. They're going to want to make that money back. So I'm sure there could be financial incentives to build something which is going to be unique by them and not bring attention to anything else which could potentially compete with it or even suppress that type of information, And I mean, that could be the same for anybody associated with Altos Labs. And
yes.
I don't know who is associated, there could be a lot of longevity doctors who have ties to Bezos. Like you said, Peter Attia was actually invited to his wedding.
Yes, correct.
Yeah.
But wow, that's a really good point. What you just said there, because that's quite enlightening for me as well. The idea that they may be a lab, but they ultimately are looking to most likely make their money back or make a profit, right? So it's not necessarily just pure research, go and find all of these solutions and stuff. And that,
well,
to me,
as much as some of these labs may claim to be a nonprofit or a charity or a philanthropist, what's the word?
Yes.
Philanthropist.
Yeah.
Oftentimes, if you really look into them, they're sending money between other companies which they are invested in some type of way or have a connection with, so it's not really the philanthropy or whatever.
Yeah. So it's funny because you're right. A lot of the times these nonprofits will exist just to like cook the books and things like that, and have other kinds of reasons to exist outside of what it looks like on the surface. I will say that a lot of things are not what they seem. But yeah, you made a brilliant point, Brenden, about the fact that the research that they're doing, most likely they may have discovered a lot of the things that you've discovered as well. It's very possible. It's just that they don't really have the incentive to share it if they're looking to create a product or something which they can profit from. So it would make a lot of sense if a lot of these ultra wealthy, ultra elite people actually do a lot of the things that you talk about and that you share, but they're never going to reveal it publicly because that will harm their bottom line, or it'll harm a lot of the potential profits that they could make very deeply. So that's actually a fantastic point, and it would make a ton of sense. So, okay, knowing that a lot of the longevity industry that we're in is very much focused on trying to maximize profit, and that means that they're looking for new avenues to do this. What would you say is the right path? And I don't mean for you to necessarily cover everything, but just on a simple level, if you could, what would you say is the right path that people should be focusing on if they want to not just avoid dying, but also like straight up live longer?
Well, I think they need to look at their biology as a unified system, and a unified system needs to have many vectors leveraged in order to make a significant difference in the outcome of the aging process. So rather than look towards a specific intervention or a supplement or reducing the risk of the biggest killers in the world, they need to look more of a complete view of the human body. And so there are major regulatory systems which are responsible for controlling different aspects of the aging process that all have a significant contribution to the aging process. And these should be approached not in isolation, but all together, all combined. And you need to have interventions that can go in there for each of the major pillars that drive the aging processes.
Gotcha. So it is very much about being as holistic as possible when it comes to this stuff. And your preference, actually, let me reword that. Not necessarily a preference. I'm sure that you do cover a lot of the same things that Peter Attia does as well. Isn't that right, Brenden? Like you also,
of course.
Yes, yeah. Right. That's almost like
I mean, my cardiovascular and metabolic mastery, it's a specific pillar of mine of longevity and age reversal.
Yes.
But I have 12 pillars. That's just one pillar. And I would say that Peter Attia focuses on that one, cardiovascular and metabolic mastery. He focuses on mitochondrial optimization, although that one is incomplete, if I would say, just because the main interventions he has there is like exercise and zone 2 cardio and things of that nature, without even having much of a supplement or peptide routine to go along with it, which would make it more complete in my view. But these are just 2 pillars out of like 12 major regulatory systems that drive the aging processes, you know. So rather than just focus on 1 or 2 of these pillars in isolation, I would recommend that you focus on all of the major ones which are identified, and not just take random supplements or throw random things at, you know, each of these systems, but take the most fundamentally complete and best approach to controlling each of these systems.
Gotcha. And that's quite a comprehensive approach that you've got there with 12 pillars, because just like you said, it seems like even people like Peter Attia are really only focusing on 2 or so out of the 12. And so you're being really comprehensive here. Could you quickly run through what those 12 pillars are?
Neurorejuvenation and cognitive enhancement, and transform how you look with looks enhancement. The other ones I named off, they're environmental detox and adaptive resilience, mitochondrial and performance optimization, immune system rejuvenation, cardiovascular and metabolic mastery, microbiome gut immune access, autophagy and cellular cleanup, renew your own stem cells, epigenetics and chromatin control, senescent cell removal, and nutrition mastery.
Yes. And so for the people listening, I do want to be very clear that we mentioned before that someone like Peter Attia would focus on like the first part of that, right? Which is just making sure you don't die to the biggest killers, the 4 horsemen of death, as he calls them. Brenden's approach and what we do at Cutting Edge Longevity, it goes far beyond that. This is like really the high end stuff, like the highest end stuff I've ever seen. And it would not surprise me, obviously I have no proof in saying this, but it really would not surprise me if the wealthiest people in the world, truly the wealthiest people in the world, are using these kinds of interventions. It also would not surprise me if even those guys and those labs are missing some of the ones that Brenden has found. Like that wouldn't surprise me either, because Brenden is extraordinarily thorough, and I've never seen anyone be as thorough as him when it comes to this kind of research. So it truly wouldn't surprise me if he knows more than what a lot of is going on there too.
Well, there's 2 things there, Dan, that you mentioned. The first is that there's 12 major pillars, which I identified, and most people may only be incorporating a couple of these in their practice. But the second part of it is that some people may only be using very limited interventions or the wrong interventions for controlling these 12 pillars, you know, and fundamentally their solutions could be incomplete, you know, versus what we're doing. So 2 important things there.
Yeah, absolutely. I would actually say it's probably pretty likely that what they're doing is incomplete, even if they're you know, working on a pillar that is valid, because there's a lot of things that people in the longevity space are pushing and having pushed on them, right? So even, and I'm not sure your feelings on these, Brenden, but if I were to list off some like common things that I see from people in the longevity space, we'd be talking about like rapamycin, or like metformin, be like GLP-1s for longevity and things like that.
Well, look, the way I would put it is a lot of the interventions that I see personally, people discussing on YouTube, would be like trying to take a bicycle up Mount Everest versus just flying to the top, which would be what my interventions are. You know, it's really that big of a difference. It's the vehicles that they are using to reach a particular outcome are just not the best vehicles, you know, they won't get very far.
So it's like the most popular stuff in the vast majority of cases is really not the ideal approach. That's honestly what it seems like. The more that I work with you and the other people we work with, the more I realize that the best approaches really are just vastly unknown. You know, the most popular stuff is usually really not the best. In fact, it's usually quite bad, and sometimes it's outright the complete opposite of what you want.
You know, what I've seen is some people on these social media platforms who have found my stuff and my 12 pillars were thinking that they could just take these pillars and throw them into AI and then have AI tell them the most effective strategy for each of them to reach their goal. And when I saw the things that this AI was actually recommending people to do, I just laughed because it was absolutely terrible.
I hope it's not going to make them just more likely to die sooner, you know, like that kind of thing.
Well, it will at least waste a lot of money, you know, probably tens of thousands of dollars for very little results.
That's actually something I want to touch on too, just the idea of AI and how many people are relying on it for like health and biology advice. I mean, honestly, I would say, so I use AI a lot, like in my line of work and everything. And so I would say I have a pretty decent understanding of its shortcomings and what it can and can't do. I would just say that I would never, ever rely on it to tell me an answer unless I already like knew what the answer should be. Do you know what I mean? Unless there was some level of judgment or expertise that I could actually like use to evaluate its answer, there is no way, especially when it comes to biology and health and longevity and things like that, that I would just type into ChatGPT or another AI and just trust what it says. Like, if you're going to do that, at the very least, ask someone like Brenden or an expert that you trust to like look over it, right? Because my goodness, the amount of hallucinations and BS these things can put out, especially in areas that are not that well studied. So if you're getting to the cutting edge of this stuff where there hasn't been that much like research and things like that, I would say it's more likely to throw more hallucinations at you because it just doesn't have as much to draw from, and it has to make like extrapolations and guesses. So we found that in the peptide space, by the way. I would say it's absolutely awful for peptides, AI tools. And so it wouldn't surprise me, Brenden, if it's very similar with the longevity space. And from what you said,
you know, Dan, I saw something earlier today. It was actually a study which just came out showing intergenerational aptitude test. So they tested essentially the IQ of like Gen Z today, and they compared it to the intelligence of others, such as their parents, millennials. And for the first time in history, the results showed that the Gen Z today are actually dumber. And to put it bluntly, you know, and I just wondered if some of that has to do with technological advancements or like the over reliance on AI, which is disrupting people's ability to think for themselves, you know. It's just one possibility that came to mind.
Yes. But. Yeah, I believe that some research has been done to show that there's definitely like cognitive atrophy from relying on AI too much. And I think combine that with instant gratification, the ADHD type of vibe that the internet can do, and like social media and TikTok, and you know, I mean, they call it like TikTok brain, and it wouldn't surprise me if that was like actually contributing to a lower IQ as well. But that is pretty alarming, and it doesn't surprise me, but it is pretty alarming. But let that just be for anyone listening. Let that be a lesson to really, if you're going to use AI to ask it these kinds of questions, be very discerning and please evaluate the answers for yourself. Don't just trust it. Don't just believe it, because the amount of lies that it'll tell you confidently, that like our brains are wired to trust confidence, you know, and so it's almost like these AI tools bypass a lot of our discernment because we're just like, oh, it's like an oracle, you know, it's like Google, but it's AI. No, that's not what it is. And I think a lot of people can get caught up in that trap. So I urge you, if you've been using AI a lot for your biological and health advice, to please at least get it confirmed by a real expert, a human expert. At least if they hallucinate, you can tell by their behavior that they're probably on like psychedelics or something. But yeah, moving on from that topic, Brenden. Let's say someone has been following Peter Attia or even someone like Brian Johnson or the big longevity names for a while, and they're doing the typical things that those guys will tell them about, which are usually things like cold plungers and sauna and fasting and maybe things like metformin or rapamycin and just things like that. To those guys, what would you actually tell them to be the first thing to redirect them from that? Because that's clearly not the ideal approach here.
Well, the first thing is to consider what your biology actually needs. There are some interventions which can be universally applicable to everybody, things which could benefit everybody's health collectively. And like there would be no reason not to use them or include them in part of your routine or your supplementation or whatever. But you need to realize that not everybody's biology should have or even needs the same interventions as somebody else. And there's a lot of unique variables at play there. It really depends on your unique biology, your own biomarkers, which your blood work shows, and your overall condition that will determine, what type of interventions are most appropriate for you.
Gotcha.
And so if you don't know how to discern these types of things, then, well, I would recommend that you slow down and learn actually how to do this before you just start taking stuff randomly, because taking stuff randomly that you don't need could lead to adverse outcomes to your health. It could lead to side effects. It could lead to just wasting money. Like you just said, metformin. That's a recommendation a lot of people just throw out for longevity purposes, but not many people know that metformin reduces the thiamine transporters in the gut so that your body actually uptakes less thiamine. Thiamine is critically important for brain function, so having a deficiency there could even affect your cognition. And also metformin can reduce the absorption of B12. So people then, over the course of many years, since your body actually can store B12 in the liver, which is very unique to B12 and not so much the other B vitamins, but you could end up with a deficiency there over time of taking metformin, so there are many things to consider, which you just don't hear anybody else talking about. And, as a longevity tool in and of itself, I can't recommend something like a drug like metformin for everybody. That's going too far.
Yeah, you make a brilliant point there, Brenden, I think, because especially when it comes to online media, social media, YouTube, TikTok, things like that, Instagram, whatever it is, there is definitely an incentive for people to get engagement, right? And I think engagement is usually highest when it comes to the simplest and easiest things to talk about. And so it's simply easier for people to make these blanket recommendations and make these generalizations and just be like, metformin, good, and it's like, you make a brilliant point when it's like, it's good depends on what your body actually needs. What's your objective? What's your current state, right? And that's something that I've seen you and our teammates be very, very big on, that specificity and precision is a really big deal, because you have to understand what you're doing, why you're doing it, and how everything comes together and fits together. I
said, even if you did need a certain intervention to reach a certain outcome, say you're a diabetic and you have very high glucose levels, there are many vehicles that you can use to lower the glucose levels and reach your goal, but many are superior to others, and many are inferior to others. It just depends on your unique situation, first of all, which one would be most optimal for you to take. It depends on many factors. So you can't universally say this drug here is the best one that you take. No, it depends on many things.
Yeah, exactly. And even speaking of metformin, I remember you talking about, I think it was that person who heard that same story, that metformin was really good for certain things, but they were also taking berberine, I believe it was, and they took both, not realizing that they would have adverse effects when taking both. I believe it was blood pressure related or something like that.
Yeah, so both of these drugs affect mitochondrial complex 1 of the electron transport chain. So this is a complex on the inner mitochondrial membrane, which is responsible for the generation of ATP. And when you inhibit this partially, it can be beneficial for lowering glucose levels. But if you inhibit it too much, it can be very dangerous for the cells themselves. And if you inhibit it too much, the cells can die and you can actually die. This has been seen with very powerful mitochondrial complex 1 inhibitors like rotenone. So when you start stacking these things like berberine and metformin, which both do this, they can adversely affect potentially the heart, especially in susceptible individuals, because your heart, it never rests. It's constantly pumping. It needs to have adequately functioning mitochondria in order to continue to function. And if you inhibit one of those major complexes too far, then you could potentially push something into a danger zone. So
Gotcha. Yeah, and that's what happened to the
berberine also had another off-target effect. I can't recall exactly what it is off the top of my head, but I do have it written in an article on cuttingedgelongevity.com under the blog section if you want to check it out. There's another detail which has an adverse effect on the heart as well, which may not be problematic in and of itself if you're just taking berberine by itself, but when you start combining it with other things like metformin and you have maybe you're at higher risk for having complications in general, it can push you over the edge,
Yeah, the reason I brought that up is because I remember that one of the articles that you wrote about this, and I was like, yeah, it was literally that exact point where people would hear about metformin being good, and then they end up taking it. And I think they had a really adverse reaction because
they actually had to get a pacemaker, Dan. They ended up in the hospital with bradycardia, which is really low heart rate, and their heart was basically stopping. So they actually had to get a pacemaker inputted so to keep them alive in case their heart would stop, And so it could be very, very, very dangerous.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that just proves the point. You really have to know what you're doing. You really have to take into consideration the nuances, the complexities. It's not just like put stuff in your body and it's just universally good for you. Some things are like that, but not everything. Yeah.
Okay, so the other mechanism, I just looked it up here, was actually agonism of the M2 muscarinic receptors. And when you do this, the contraction of the heart starts to decrease and drop. And if you do that in combination with inhibiting mitochondrial complex 1 too much, then you're really starting to ask for trouble. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Okay. So knowing what we know, at least what we've covered today when it comes to a lot of the common and mainstream longevity solutions that are out there, at some point we probably could even go into depth in that, by the way, and like dismantle each one by one. That would probably be a great interview, Brenden. But for now, knowing what we know, knowing that if you want real longevity, which covers not just preventing you from dying, but also from truly enhancing your biology, optimizing your biology, getting you to a place where you truly can just live longer than what people expect. And that's the work that you do here at Cutting Edge Longevity. Knowing this is the real longevity stuff. This isn't the watered down stuff. This isn't the profit driven stuff where we're beholden to, certain approaches where we can create a new product and then sell it with a patent. Who would you say Cutting Edge Longevity is really for? And what would you say makes our approach different from the other stuff out there? I know we covered some of this, but if you could summarize what makes it different?
Well, first of all, if I wanted to just make the most amount of money, it would probably be the easiest to just create some sort of supplement, which is very easy to make, have good marketing for it, and somehow get a bunch of other people on board with it who have low ethics and morals, but are highly intrigued by having a high commission and having them help spread the word and just sell it like crazy. But what I actually created is probably one of the most difficult things to actually profit from, because not many people actually can understand fully what it does. And it is optimizing your biology from all of the major 12 upstream pillars, which I have identified, in the most complete way possible so that you can live the longest time possible, reverse aging to the highest extent possible today with what's available today, and also have a good health span. So you want to have a high quality of life while you live a long time, And just one thing that comes to mind as an example of that is that Peter Attia does touch upon exercise as a major contributor for longevity. But if your joints are so broken down and degraded that you reach a point where you're 70 or 80 years old and you can't exercise anymore because it's just too painful, then that's going to fall off the table and you're not going to be able to perform it anymore. So having a good and optimal health span would include things such as making sure your joints stay healthy long term so that you can continue to live a healthy lifestyle, but also not be in pain and such, so.
Truly comprehensive, truly holistic. That's something I really appreciate about the work that you do, Brenden. Yeah.
The work that I've done to create this unified system, it's not something which is just standardized recommendations all across the board for everybody. That's something I advocate against very strongly. I consider somebody's unique biology and biomarkers and take everything into account, as well as cross-referencing all the different biomarkers before recommending that they take anything for each of these 12 pillars, And that's essentially what I've created with the Biological Recode System. A big part of it is driven by the Biological Recode Engine, which is what actually takes all of your lab results, as well as inputs like your age, your gender, your body weight, and such, and a few questions as well. And it will give you a completely phased program, which is most optimal for your unique biology, almost as effectively as I would be able to do if I was writing like a personalized longevity program. It takes that many things into consideration, and it will give the direct supplements, peptides. If there's any medications that are potentially needed, it'll give those as well. It'll tell you the exact doses, how many times a day to take it, as well as direct buy links and stuff. So it's very comprehensive and complete. And I would recommend doing that for anybody who is actually interested in taking age reversal to the highest extent possible, as well as having a good health span, looking younger as well. And I believe that's the best that's available today. I haven't seen anything else that comes close to anything like it,
Yeah, there's a few things that I want to say about that, Brenden. So the first one is the Biological Recode System is basically the full course and program that you put together, which covers all 12 pillars that you discussed today, the 12 pillars of longevity. And the amount of depth that you go into is quite insane into each pillar as well. And then you bring them together and you tie them together holistically. So the Biological Recode System itself is phenomenal for people that want to know how this stuff works. And then you talk about the Biological Recode Engine, which is something that really shocked me with how it works, because what you've essentially done, and this is one of the most mind-blowing things I've seen, is actually you managed to put all of that information, all of that knowledge that you have about the 12 pillars, and you condensed it down into this engine, which essentially allows people to, just like you mentioned, put in their details, put in whether it's their lab work, whether it's their age, their weight, things like that, and then get the ideal recommendations for them so that they can maximize their longevity, right? But the level of speed and efficiency that people get from this is quite insane. So there's two parts to that, right? The system, which is provided if you want to understand exactly how all of it works from point A to point Z, and you want to complete roadmap, you want a complete blueprint, you want a complete encyclopedia, if you will, of all of that knowledge that Brenden's put together. And then the engine is where you can simply just plug in some numbers, plug in some data, and then you will get legitimately the best recommendations for you when it comes to this stuff. And when we say that it really is the best recommendations, we mean it. Brenden and our team have done a lot of transformation programs, done a lot of one-on-one work with clients and things like that, a lot of private work with very wealthy clients as well. And we've seen that this engine can do a large amount of that kind of work without the hand-holding, right? It'll just tell you straight up, this is what to do, this is how you do it, this is how you dose it. And it'll even give you links to buy, products and things that we recommend, like you mentioned. So I really am quite impressed and quite amazed at the fact that all this has been put together. And I just wanted to mention that there are both of those, because on one hand, it's for the person that wants to learn everything and master all of it. And then on the other hand, it's for the person that just wants results and just wants to be told what to do and just wants simplicity. So both of those people really, really will benefit from this.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. That sums it up very well.
Yeah. Cool. So last question for you, Brendan, before we close. Actually, I apologize. There's two more. First question is, where can people get the biological recode system and the biological recode engine?
So you could go to cuttingedgelongevity.com. And then once you're there, if you click on the age reversal tab, it'll take you right to the biological recode system, and you could read about it right there, and you could purchase it directly from that page. So
excellent. Yeah. And highly, highly recommended. If you've ever wanted to get the kind of results that you would get from working with Brenden personally, but obviously without the hand holding, without the like 3-month journey, which has its own merits, if you wanted to just get it quickly, ASAP, this is a great way of doing it, especially if you're interested in longevity. If there's other issues that you have, or you have a particular health problems or other goals outside of that, then it's different. But when it comes to
it's the closest thing you can get to having the best age reversal program outside of, well, beyond working with just me myself. It's the next best thing besides working with me. And in some ways, it's actually better if you factor in that it's faster. So you won't have to wait on a list for me to get back to you and then build your program over the course of however long it takes. You can get the system, get the lab work that you need, and input your details and have the program delivered basically instantly, so much faster than working with me directly and almost as effective.
Love it. Yep, excellent. So last question for you, Brendan, before we finish off here. If you could give one piece of advice to someone who's been following the mainstream longevity gurus, but they feel like they're not getting the results that they really want, what would you tell them?
Oh, well, I think I answered this one earlier in the video, to be honest, Dan. And that was to take a step back and first of all, consider what all of these recommendations are for. More often than not, you'll see that most of these longevity supplements and things of that nature are working downstream from some of these major regulatory systems. And oftentimes they're even doing things which can be detrimental. But in terms of how you would figure out if they're detrimental or not, you'd really have to be a deep level researcher in order to discern that, So I would say the first thing is just be very cautious about some of these supplements that they're recommending as the next best thing. Go to the actual studies if you can, read them if you can interpret them. If you can't, then try to find somebody who is able to help you break down the study and actually discern it, but also understand how it works on a mechanistic level. Because let me give you an example. A lot of people were pushing this one supplement for longevity purposes, for autophagy induction, which sounds great. But they were using a really high dose of niacinamide in there, which is a specific form of niacin. And if you take too much, then it can actually have adverse effects on your health. It can reduce your insulin sensitivity. It could raise your homocysteine levels. It could be bad. And we've actually seen that with some prior clients of ours, But if you don't understand how that actually works or everything about it, then you'll have a hard time knowing that. I mean, obviously, a lot of our clients were pretty smart, right? They've worked with a lot of the top longevity gurus and stuff online today, but yet they were fooled by some of these supplements thinking that it would be beneficial for their health when it was actually harming their health. So I would say just be more cautious about the supplements, studying them, but also remember that you really need to approach biology from an upstream perspective rather than downstream. How can you target a system that is failing upstream, which is driving these downstream processes and causing the aging process? So
yeah,
that's basically it.
Yeah, I would just add on to that with the idea of like, be very careful who you trust, because a lot of the stuff today, especially when it's being pushed by influencers, and in a way, I would say that popularity is almost an inverse indicator of effectiveness, as strange as that may sound. And I would say that a lot of the people who are not pushing products heavily, for example, I know someone like Brian Johnson will say that he's just giving it all out for free. And in a sense, he is sharing a lot of information for free. But I would just say that a lot of that information is around the idea of just don't die, right? Which, great advice, like don't die. but it's not the next level, which is where Brenden is going. You know what I mean? Brenden takes that part of don't die into account, and he covers all of that very, very thoroughly. And then he goes to the next level, right? And that's what cutting edge longevity is about, is that it's going far beyond to the next level. Whereas guys like Peter Attia, Brian Johnson, they really are only covering the first part of that. And so if you want true cutting edge longevity, the biological recode system and engine and all of this stuff that Brendan's talking about is where you find it. So, ladies and gentlemen, I hope you guys enjoyed this. Brenden, thank you for joining me on this one. Thank you for answering my questions, and thanks for explaining this to everyone, man. This was really, really good.
Yeah, no problem, Dan. Thank you for having me on.
Fantastic. See everyone later.